there's a bias against congregate facilities and congregate living. When we speak of, the funding that we're going to spend to address the crisis of homelessness that we're experiencing in California and LA County and in every locality that we have, there's a bias against the notion that congregate facilities can effectively serve, and congregate facilities are not often mentioned by elected officials, and they're not brought up in the policy discussion. And then when we talk to individuals that are very important within the permanent supportive housing and continuums of care, we heard anecdotes where they're thinking of quote-unquote boarding cares as human warehouses, or similarly unfortunate monikers that don't really describe the important services that these facilities provide.
Hello, friends. This is Carrie Morrison. Welcome to Heartforward, Conversations from the Heart. For the next 2 weeks, we are going to present a 2-part interview to unpack a long-awaited report that was issued in August of this year. Since 2016, I've been watching a slow-motion train wreck that involves our system of board and care homes, not only in LA County, but throughout the state of California. As you will hear, these facilities provide housing for vulnerable people living with mental illness and who are unable to live in settings that would require a greater level of independence, such as permanent supportive housing. I am not alone in this worry. I want to give a shout out to a group we affectionately refer to as the Dream Team. They know who they are. And recently we met with the authors of this research study you will learn about in this podcast, Aimery Thomas and Leila Towry of the Future Organization. Nobody talks about these precious housing resources. As you will hear from these 2 interviews, they are not included in what would be described as the housing continuum in our county, because the federal government does not recognize housing that is not attached to a lease agreement as legitimate. Nothing substitutes for actually reading this report, which is downloadable and accessible to all via the link in the episode notes. But I hope this interview helps to surface some key issues that our policymakers should take into consideration as they look to protect and perhaps expand this particular housing resource. Well, good morning, Aimery and Leila. It's so great to see you today in the podcast studio. Thank you for driving in this morning to have a conversation.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Awesome. Well, we are going to take a look at this study that you have been working on for well over a year, much awaited and full of information, which our challenge is going to be to unpack this for our listeners and hopefully stimulate them to actually read the report. But if anything, we want them to walk away today with an understanding of some of the important findings and observations and ultimately recommendations, which we're going to tackle in a second part of this interview. So thank you for agreeing to go on this journey with us. The report is called Serving Our Vulnerable Populations, Los Angeles County Adult Residential Facilities and Residential Care Facilities for the Elderly. And it was published just last month in August. So before we get into the study, tell me a little bit about your organization, the Future Organization, which the title in and of itself begs for a bit of a description. Who and what is the Future Organization, and what is your niche in this space?
Well, the Future Organization is our research and consulting firm. It was founded in 2018 by myself as a sole proprietorship when I moved back to Los Angeles, native Los Angelino from Australia, because I was over there about 15 years. I wanted to bring a lot of the sorts of work together under one umbrella to serve this community here. And I learned, serving communities in Australia and across the Asia Pacific. And then met up with my partner, Leila, and she wanted in, and she brings a lot of great experiences, from the Southern California community, serving a range of nonprofits across housing and other areas. We really focus on delivering evidence-based work based on research, looking at how to better serve our communities, serving vulnerable populations. And we really want to model best practice for government, nonprofits, and for anyone that we can help. We serve all sorts of organizations from startup nonprofits up to some of our county's largest agencies. And
how did you find the Future Organization, Leila? And you wanted in, is what I hear.
I wanted in. So I have worked in the affordable housing and permanent supportive housing and healthcare space, planning and running programs. And I saw the opportunity to deliver more research and evidence-based practice, because being on the ground, I saw a lot of sort of fitting in a lot of programs with the same number of staff. And I understood that there was an opportunity to bring more change management and data-driven decision making to how we fund programs. And so I joined in 2020, right before the pandemic. And, we just built it from that time. And it's been a journey.
Excellent.
And we discovered the board and care
crisis together.
Facility crisis together, and we're really happy to be here to be able to share this.
Well, what we're going to hear today is going from what were anecdotes and kind of thoughts and opinions we had a couple years ago, and now you've got actual data, and this is something we've been waiting for a long time. So let's talk a little bit about this study to begin with. What's the genesis of this study? Where was it incubated? Who decided that this was important to undertake? How was it funded? And what's the basic purpose?
Well, as Leila mentioned, we had a lot of interactions both with individual board and care operators. Your listeners may be familiar with Barbara Wilson. Mm-hmm. We had a collaboration with her in Mental Health Hookup where we helped them get a grant from the Cigna Foundation. Actually, Leila wrote that grant and helped them deploy a community-based telehealth platform to board and care operators across the county. And when we started to interact more with NAMI GLAC, and they were starting to...
So for people who don't know, what is NAMI GLAC? Because there are a lot of lay people listen to this podcast.
Sorry, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, Greater Los Angeles County.
Right.
They received a contract from Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health to establish an organization or an association for board and care operators, ARF and RCFE operators that are serving vulnerable populations. We assisted NAMI GLAC in that endeavor. And one of the things that we really found when we started to look at who's going to join this organization, what do they look like, how many of them are there, whom specifically do they serve in our communities, we found that there are a lot of gaps in data. And we sourced data from the state level, from the Community Care Licensing Division, which is the regulatory agency that licenses all of the licensed adult residential care facilities in the state. And we just wanted to know more. When you're going to engage in trying to create a good organization and one that's really going to serve its members, you got to understand who those members are, and you really got to understand their demographics and their needs. And that's where we saw a gap.
And so you presented this idea for a study to who?
Well, we talked to everyone in the room, basically. We talked to the county. We talked to our community advocates and stakeholders, a very diverse group of folks. And then we were fortunate enough to encounter, actually, this happened slightly before the LARC engagement, but there is a collaborative effort from the California Community Foundation and LA County DMH. They had advertised a RFP for initiative of multiple activities to be delivered by nonprofits and potentially a consulting firm like ours. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, that got delayed. But then we started to come into contact with a couple of stakeholders, from Cedars-Sinai, California Community Foundation, and LA County DMH. And about 2 years after they had initially offered it, we sort of organically got their attention, and then we wrote a customized proposal and research design to be able to execute this study.
Excellent. Okay, so those are the basic players behind this.
Yeah, California Community Foundation, Cedars-Sinai is a major funder, Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, and Genesis Los Angeles. And of course, we cannot forget Brilliant Corners, who act as our direct client in this endeavor. And I guess, Leila, do you want to talk a bit about Brilliant Corners?
Brilliant Corners does a lot of things and has a lot of interface with the county. They also develop supportive housing across a range of populations. So that was a natural fit, and they played a very supportive role in getting the word out so that we could engage research participants and bring this to the finish line. Yeah,
and I will point out that representatives from Brilliant Corners came with us on the Trieste delegation in 2019 to see their system.
Wonderful.
So I was very impressed with kind of the broad orientation of that nonprofit. And Leila, just like if you were to be in an elevator and you had 8 floors to describe to someone what this study is all about, what would you say?
That's a great question. we did obviously a lot of that research or engagement to get people involved in the study. But what we told owners and operators was we're doing a study to better understand the population and the connections and intersectionality with homelessness and the resources that licensed adult residential facilities provide.
Excellent. Okay, I think you're on the 5th floor.
To improve the system, and I could keep going.
Do you want me to go to the penthouse?
Yeah, if you feel like we need to.
In terms of the study, we want it to be a resource for everyone at every level, from family members who have loved ones that are in these facilities to decision makers at the top levels of our government that are deciding how to spend money and whom to fund and where to fund, and everyone in between. We thought that it would perhaps serve as a reasonably good, reliable source of truth that would set some ground beneath everyone's feet and create common ground for people to be able to talk about these issues relating to these facilities.
Excellent. Well, that's the perfect segue into the very first couple questions I want to ask you, because this is a research study, there are terms that you use that help to define the subject matter and make sure that they're value neutral, et cetera. So I think it is best that we use those terms in the course of this conversation, but I'm just going to want your help to define them. First of all, what is the market?
Yes, we have this term, the market, that we use. So the market very specifically is the population of facilities. So there are about 3,060 facilities that were licensed in Los Angeles County, both adult residential facilities and residential care facilities for the elderly at the time that we conducted the research. So the market is the specific segment of that overall population of licensed facilities that's willing to provide services to the following vulnerable populations. So people reliant on public benefits such as SSI and other forms, people living with mental illness, people who have prior experience of homelessness. So facility owners and operators that are willing to serve one or more of those specific categories of individuals with vulnerabilities. And there are plenty of other vulnerable individuals that have other needs that are served by this market, which is very important to note. But our research in this particular market that we're talking about, the 750 facilities, those are facilities that are either currently or willing to serve individuals with those specific needs.
And one of the things I recall from one of our preliminary conversations to prepare for this is that you pointed out that those who are in this market are businesses.
That's right. And, to utilize a terminology, a market, when you're talking about business owners, and, there's nothing wrong with being a business owner, especially when your business involves serving people. And we have to respect, that the owners and operators within the market, they have to sustain their businesses and their livelihoods. And, there's a lot of diversity of the businesses that are within this market. You have very, very small family-run businesses that are, quote unquote, mom and pop. They're often, 6 licensed beds or less. And then you have much larger organizations and operations owning potentially more than one facility. And some facilities even have sizes, well over 100 beds. And they all play a very important role in serving this area of care.
Perfect. So that is the market. And Leila, within this market, and Aimery has already used the terminology of adult residential facility, ARF, residential care facility for the elderly, RCFE. These are acronyms, but I think we agreed that we are going to use these acronyms and not the more colloquial board and care home. But can you just unpack for the listeners, what is an ARF and an RCFE? In your mind's eye, what do you see when you look at them?
Sure. The technical definition of the adult residential facility, or ARF, is they serve individuals between the ages of 18 and 59 and a half, technically. They can get a waiver to extend that and serve folks over a certain age, especially if they have a history of living there for a certain amount of time and they don't want to transition them on. And then the residential care facilities for the elderly serve older adults, 60 plus, seniors, technically, who need assistance with their activities of daily living. And that market, we understand it to be predominantly, and we'll probably go into more detail later in the podcast, predominantly serving private, family members who place their loved ones in a facility, but they're also funded through state programs like the assisted living waiver.
And would it be fair to say, because as we have talked about board and care homes, that sometimes in the whatever public policy discussion we have in that space, they can encompass both of these types of facilities?
Correct. That term is sort of the generic term that captures all or both the ARF and the RCFE side of the market. And we're proposing to move away from that terminology because it doesn't specifically identify who's served, how they're served, or what's actually happening and what the opportunity is.
Perfect. So we will practice that nomenclature in this discussion. And then another important definition in your study is market users.
Yes.
Who are market users?
So market users are anyone from across the systems of care or the continuums of care that place residents within the market itself. So that could include homeless services organizations, that could include hospitals, that could include skilled nursing facilities, recuperative care facilities, that could include placing residents who had previously been justice involved and are coming through from the justice system, such as the courts and or prior incarceration. So there's a wide range of system users from government agencies all the way down to private individuals and families that are served by the market of board and care / ARF RCFE facilities.
And so, because when I first was reading, I was thinking a market user would be the person that lives in the facility, but no, you have this more broader definition. Yeah. Is there any other additional labeling that we would want to use for our discussion? I
would say that, referring to the people who inhabit the ARFs and RCFEs, they're the facility residents.
Okay. The residents. Very good. And then the owners and operators are those who actually are boots on the ground.
That's right. I mean, you have some owners, and it's very few owners that aren't actually participatory in running, the operations of a facility. You have the operators who have a purpose under their license. And then you have other staff members at those facilities as well that provide a range of support services and provide direct care to the residents.
So moving on to the market, one of the things that I found fascinating, and I hadn't really even thought about this until the city of Los Angeles issued a report, I believe in early 2022, the city housing department, and they defined the difference between what we would call the continuum of care in housing versus perhaps the continuum of care in more of a health context. And at that point, it was the first time I realized that ARFs and RCFEs are not technically defined as housing in the public policy realm of how we look at housing, and it originates perhaps at how the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development defines housing. And this actually is one of the underpinnings of the problems we're facing right now. So can you unpack that situation a bit?
I mean, one of the key difficulties we have in really integrating these facilities, ARFs and RCFEs, in with our other systems and continuum of care, like you noted, the federal definition of what housing is. For example, these facilities, according to HUD, they don't offer tenancy rights. So that's a key definitional point in terms of housing. They're congregate facilities, so sometimes individuals within these facilities can share a room with another individual. And then there's also sort of a gap with what we define as sort of medical facilities. So it's neither housing, it's not a medical facility, it's not a mental health facility. So it's not a IMD or Institute for Mental Disease under state law. So it falls in sort of this no man's land, with three fronts. You have the medical front, the mental health front, and you have the housing front. And that's where I think we can really definitionally get, more integration across both the minds of our decision makers and our systems of care.
I just wanted to add that while they're not health facilities, that seemed to be the understanding when we did our research. So there was confusion about whether they were skilled nursing facilities or assisted living facilities and what assisted living meant. What was really clear in talking to all the executive stakeholders through the qualitative aspect of the research was all of the health complications that the individuals they'd served were experiencing. So if they transitioned from a hospital into a board and care, there were health issues, and co or trimorbidities in terms of adding the layer of living with mental illness and possibly substance use or history of substance use. And so they are serving vulnerable individuals who have multiple health challenges.
And would you also say, and we'll have to define another term, in the housing continuum of care, people move from being homeless into supportive housing, permanent supportive housing, through what's called the coordinated entry system, which is a method to help define through an assessment process acuity levels of people's needs. And people who have high acuity needs, who maybe would be most appropriately placed into an adult residential facility, find themselves in permanent supportive housing because there's no real communication between the housing system of service and placement and the adult residential facilities. Is
Correct.
that a fair assessment?
Correct. I can go a little further on that. So the history of the assessment, that coordinated entry system called the VI-SPDAT, or short, the Vulnerability Index, started with projects like Project 50, some 15, 20 years ago.
In LA County.
Exactly, and happened in other parts of the country where providers were looking at who's the most likely to die on the street. So based on that acuity scale and how high they score, they would be prioritized to be moved indoors, which is a very noble and worthwhile endeavor. However, what type of services would those individuals be provided upon moving in? And so out of that system came the more formal VI-SPDAT, and for, probably more than a decade, I don't have the exact timeline, that's the tool that's been used. Now that tool, because unfortunately it didn't create equitable outcomes across populations because of underreporting of, health history or mental health challenges, there are disparate impacts on different populations. I don't want to go down that tangent. There's a new tool being developed, but generally, the trend is those folks have been moved indoors, and then the housing providers, the permanent supportive housing providers, are getting folks who maybe need 24-hour care and not, the model that permanent supportive housing provides, which might be an hour of case management and let's help you with your benefits, and okay, let's get you a token to use the bus to go to a medical appointment. So still sort of supporting an independent lifestyle and presuming you can pay rent and manage your bills and cook for
your
yourself
food, right.
and plan ahead and budget and all those activities of daily living. That's not necessarily the feedback we got from permanent supportive housing providers, where they're
that as well.
left saying, how did this person make it to us? And, on the coordinated entry side, well, we had to push them up. They have a voucher. We're going to put them in PSH and hope for the best, because we have to move people through the system.
One of the key research findings that we found out talking to owners and operators, and we talked to 353 of them, was that they have very little interface with LAHSA, the Los Angeles Homelessness Service Authority, or the coordinated entry system providers, because LAHSA has a number of organizations that they contract to and work with across Los Angeles County. So we have this gap in capability and interface in terms of the interface of this, the LAHSA, which is a partnership between the county and the city of Los Angeles, in really integrating board and cares, or ARFs and RCFEs, into the homelessness continuum, or the homelessness services continuum of care. And this is a critical gap that needs to be addressed to be able to maximize the capability and the utilization of ARFs and RCFEs in our community.
So I'm so glad you brought that up. And I will anecdotally say that I've witnessed this. Heartforward enters into both permanent supportive housing and board and care communities with what we call our Radical Hospitality Initiative. I have observed people living in the adult residential facility. We're going to practice changing the nomenclature, who actually, in my opinion, could be in an apartment. They would be capable of budgeting, of going to the grocery store. They actually wish they could cook their food. It's being provided for them. They could do their laundry, and they would like a job, and they are taking up a precious bed in the adult residential facility. And I have witnessed in PSH people who are stuck in their room, rarely come out, experiencing no real support and also no real sense of community because they're in their apartment. So you raise this in multiple ways in your report, that there's this fragmentation. You talk about circular service flows. You talk about underutilized beds and no ability to actually help people either graduate up or graduate down. I don't know if that's the right word, from one type of housing to another. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that, what you saw?
Well, let's take that apart and go one by one on those. So in terms of the idea of graduation, we want to, as often as possible, enable the capabilities and maximize the capability for individuals or residents at ARFs and RCFEs, in particular ARFs, to move on to other forms of housing. So once someone in ARF has the appropriate wraparound services that meet their needs, or, they are able to gain more skills, or they have the capability to once again find an independent living solution within our communities, such as PSH or assisted living, or even just being able to have rent stabilization, then we should really be encouraging those folks to move on because they're capable and hopefully willing and able to engage in those living circumstances. Because the more folks that we can graduate to permanent supportive housing or independent living or, rent control living with the stability of wraparound services, that creates additional capacity within ARFs and RCFEs to serve other individuals.
I was just going to share a story in some of the field work that we did to gather interviews from the owners or managers of facilities and the residents. We did a fair bit of door knocking when folks wouldn't answer their door. And so I made my way into a facility in the county and proceeded to interview the manager. And they were, very erudite and articulate and sharing how the facility ran and, great hospitable nature. And then a couple questions in, I realized that this person who said they were an assistant manager, they were actually, in fact, a long-term resident of the home.
Oh, my goodness.
This is maybe a 6 or 8 bed home and, definitely presented like they were leading and supporting the other residents. And so we switched gears and I went on to I said, you know what, I'm going to come back to you. We'll do the other survey tool with you. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to do, the other interview with the manager when I can. And so as we talk, they said, that they were working part-time, that they didn't feel like they could work full-time because they would lose their SSI benefits. They struggled to afford the clothing that they needed to do the work and, show up as a professional, but they very much wanted to live alone. This young man was probably 34 or 35 years old and had been there maybe 9 years. Wow. And had, identified that he had made a full recovery from his mental illness and that the facility had in fact created a safety net and a sense of family and community for him so that he could move on to the next level. But without that ability to really save money and perhaps get a voucher to subsidize part of his living expenses, it just, felt very circular to him is what he identified.
Yeah, one of the key aspects of really encouraging as many residents of, current residents, especially ARFs, when we talk about RCFEs, we understand that due to the age and the circumstance of the population, that there's far less capability to return to an independent living environment in the future. So speaking specifically to ARFs, we really need comprehensive wraparound services, training life skills, in addition to addressing the individual vulnerabilities and service needs of the populations in ARFs. We know that we have a number of individuals and residents within ARFs that sometimes they can live there upwards of 20, 30 years. And the reason that they're continuing to live there and they're not moving, this isn't universal, but some individuals within ARFs, their residents, they're not empowered to move on to other types of living arrangements because they're not receiving the types of assistance or skills training that they could, that would enable such moves.
Yeah, you mentioned in the report that you have observed that the market users, that broad universe of agencies and nonprofits and government, you feel that they're pretty unfamiliar with this market. and which is surprising to me. It's almost like an invisible resource. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really strange phenomenon. Everyone speaks of boarding cares in very broad terms, which is the problem with the terminology because it's a disambiguation. There's not a lot of information about the individual capabilities of specific facilities, in particular ARFs. A great proportion of the ARFs serve the regional center community and consumers.
Can you describe what that is?
Yeah. The regional center community serves consumers who are developmentally disabled and their families. They're funded through an alternate mechanism to other ARFs and RCFEs. And, they play a very important role in serving those individuals that have those needs. But in terms of the rest of the market, there's not a lot of understanding amongst market users about what the individual capabilities or what the collective capabilities of the market are. We get a lot of genericization. We've heard some incredibly, I would say, blunt comments about what perceptions are in terms of, what people colloquially refer to as boarding cares, and it's really unfortunate. But what we really need is specificity to understand the individual capabilities of individual facilities to serve the needs of individual residents.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that. So, and this, we think, at least from where I'm sitting, relates to data and how we track in the system. So there's two sides to this. One is in the homeless management information system. In the executive call interviews, I asked, how do you, when you do happen to place somebody, for those that knew about licensed facilities, when you place somebody in a licensed facility, how do you record that in HMIS, in the homeless management system, coordinated entry? And it's not there.
There's not
it's invisible. There's no drop down option for a licensed facility.
Wow.
It's other housing type is where some of them said they might put it, but it's not specific. Further, so if you have somebody in the coordinated entry system, once they are tracked or in other housing type, they're exited from the coordinated entry system. So they're no longer integrated in that, even if down the line something happens, they have a mental health crisis, there's a 5150, they're evicted, they're no longer in that system. On the other side of it, there's no place to track where these facilities are for those that identify.
Data blind spot.
And then the additional blind spot, and we heard this from CES providers, is they don't know how many people need boarding cares or licensed facilities, because there's no assessment or, no research to better understand what proportion of our population need an adult residential facility with supportive services or a residential care facility for the elderly or recuperative care. We don't have that understanding in our system.
That's amazing.
I mean, this also speaks to sort of the collective mindset, and there's a bias against congregate facilities and congregate living. When we speak of, the funding that we're going to spend to address the crisis of homelessness that we're experiencing in California and LA County and every locality that we have, there's a bias against the notion that congregate facilities can effectively serve, and congregate facilities are not often mentioned by elected officials, and they're not brought up in the policy discussion. And then when we talk to individuals that are very important within the permanent supportive housing and continuums of care, we heard anecdotes where they're thinking of quote unquote boarding cares as human warehouses, or similarly unfortunate monikers that don't really describe the important services that these facilities provide. And when we have a data point that, tells us that 10.6% of the individuals currently housed by ARFs and RCFEs came directly from homelessness. We know that, nearly 50% of the individuals that we encountered had prior experience of homelessness in their adult lives. We know that nearly half of them also have experience, living with mental illness and, with a diagnosed mental illness. So that's why we really wanted to do this research, because there's a lot of supposition and there's a lot of suggestion about what they think. It's almost like Plato's The Cave or something. They're, they're looking at the shadows on the wall, but they just won't turn around and see what's actually there.
Oh my gosh, that is such a great analogy. Well, that's a perfect kind of then segue into the next section of your findings about the experiences of residents and their perceptions of life in the congregate care, which actually is very favorable. And I will just anecdotally say that I personally see a greater sense of community in the ARFs I visit because people are having lunch together and they're in the courtyard together. And often you walk into the courtyard of a permanent supportive housing community. Nobody's in the courtyard. All the common areas are locked and people are in their apartments. So anyways, tell us a little bit about some of the perceptions that the residents shared about life in an ARF or an RCFE.
You know, it's really interesting. And we didn't really know what we were going to find, but in our framing the research and talking to our community partners, all of our community partners really wanted to find out how people felt about their experiences. And we had this notion, we're going to have this experience battery. You know, this is a standard thing that you run in both market and social research, but we added a couple questions to that, just simple yes or no questions. You know, do you feel safer? Do you feel a sense of community? Does this feel like a home? And overwhelmingly in all of those different categories, we found that the majority of the individuals, and we talked to 625 residents across, the county's facilities, overwhelmingly, we were finding that the vast majority, strong majorities of residents were telling us that they felt safer than their previous place that they chose to live, that they're feeling a sense of community, they were feeling a sense of home. And these are really important factors when we think about the value of these facilities and to help dispel some of the notions and the erroneous ideas that people have about congregate facilities.
Yes, the very first couple interviews I did when I started this podcast during the pandemic was my pandemic pivot was with Teresa Pasquini and Lauren Vitagliata about the notion of housing that heals. And people need a sense of community. They need friends, and they need just that the therapeutic aspect of community, which I personally think you can find in congregate living perhaps more than we give credit for. But that's my personal opinion.
I couldn't disagree with that. I mean, these congregate facilities, ARFs and RCFEs, they have a natural social fabric. And perhaps in our rush to focus on, everyone needs an individual unit or an individual space, we neglect to see the value of community and the value of being drawn together in other ways.
Well, it's astounding to me that you talked to 625 residents, because in this policy debate we have about ARFs and RCFEs, I think we forget about the people who live there. We are looking at the statistics and how many are closing and how underfunded they are, but we really have missed the human beings that are living there. Tell me a little bit more about what we found out about the people who are living in these facilities, Leila. I'm going to let Aimery add on to this afterwards, but in terms of the individuals, very diverse, reflective of the Los Angeles population, their histories, a range of situations and sort of, I guess, what I'd call a qualifying event or a crisis that led to, loss of housing. And, either they got, mental health intervention or hospitalization for a health issue and couldn't sustain their bills anymore. So something that kind of broke for them and then led them down a pathway where they landed in a licensed facility and then found a home. But culturally and racially diverse in age, range of histories, people with bachelor's degrees or some college, education, basic education met and, promise and opportunity to me. I mean, what was really clear is they all had interests, skills, and assets and, contributions that they could make. Could be made.
To give back. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a very dynamic range of individuals being housed in these facilities. I mean, in terms of some of the residents that we spoke to former lawyers, we spoke to former doctors, engineers, performers, artists, people from all walks of life, all cultural heritages, religions, creeds, etc. And really the lesson here is that these facilities are serving a great diversity across a great number of our communities, yet they're being unrecognized for the service and the diversity that they serve. And that's a bit of a tragedy.
And I just wanted to highlight one other thing that really kind of shook me. which is not in the research because it just came up a couple times in direct interviews, was that while you have the individuals living in these facilities that had a traumatic event, you have mothers and fathers, their daughters, their husbands, wives, etc. But many of these individuals lost children in the system. And so it left me thinking, where are their children now?
Right.
Are they in a different licensed facility?
Interesting.
So I just want to put a pin in that. That's a personal thought I had.
I've noticed that also in the visits I've made, people who have lost all contact with family, and you just really want to go on a discovery mission to reunite them. One of the a bit of a sad finding about the residents, you asked questions about their level of confidence that they will be able to continue living there, or this will continue to be a stable home for them. And the findings were kind of surprising how they perceive this.
Yes. So we posed the question whether or not they were confident that their facility would serve as a permanent home, or if they felt that they had achieved a sense of permanency in their living arrangements. And it wasn't a really great result, to be honest with you. A lot of individuals, and again, this was on a sort of Likert scale or a 0 to 10 kind of scoring. Our average is, I believe, somewhere around 4. And to be frank, there's a perfectly rational explanation for this, and that's the traumas and the experiences of these individuals and residents that they've had in terms of their journeys. They've had some very difficult journeys and experiences with our systems of care and our systems of order, in society. And if you contextualize that and, with their life circumstances and journeys, you can understand why they may be hesitant to trust in the permanence. And this kind of contradicts a bit about the sense of home and community. And we know that they're really feeling a very strong sense of home and community, but from a humanistic perspective, we can really understand why they may be hesitant to believe that this will last forever. Because if you're a person who has complex life experiences and traumas, it's hard to, I suppose, believe that anything lasts forever.
I just wanted to add that, so we did talk to law enforcement and, among some of the stakeholders that we engaged in the qualitative interviewing. And one person reported that sometimes the police are being used as a tool of the business rather than going through the proper measure to treat a person with appropriate mental health resources or prevention or hospitalization, and that if they had more resources, the situations would be presentable. So if you're a resident in a licensed facility and you see those types of interactions happening, you realize it's not up to you. Mm-hmm. But there's a story from a coordinated entry provider who did street outreach, and I thought it was interesting because it really represents sort of the nature of the movement in the system and the interface with coordinated entry and how challenging it is for the people who are boots on the ground. But the person said, the last person I placed in a board and care, she didn't stay too long. What she ended up doing is going to the board and care, then the hospital, through the emergency room for a few weeks. Then they sent her to recuperative care. So after that, we're stuck again. She'll find the next hospital and do the same thing for a few more weeks. We see her on the streets in between. She's been out there since 2018. She's hard to track down and prove that she's homeless because she's all over the place. She was matched with ICMS, which is Integrated Case Management Services. But that match was to get housing, but she didn't want to go through all the steps and requirements. So it was always back and forth. The case manager, ICMS worker, dropped it, couldn't do it. Working on Section 8 for her with case management services and housing. She's 68. So
she's 68 years old?
68-year-old.
Oh,
just
wow.
bouncing from here to there. And, at the point of the interview, they had been trying to work with her on the streets for 68 years, but in and out of boarding care, in and out of medical settings.
Okay, I'm sorry. For 6 to 8 years?
So she was 68. She's 68
okay.
in 2022.
They'd been working with her for several
4 or 5 years.
Okay, sorry.
On the street.
That's
that instability, so maybe that's behind some of that lack of confidence.
Right.
It's just seeing what's happening with your fellow community members.
When someone finally makes it, everything it took them to
or I'm here now,
there.
but I've been through so many, transfer traumas.
Right. So let's talk about the next section of your research, which is on the needs of the owners and operators, who I think are really the unsung heroes in this whole passion play that's playing out because of their incredible commitment and heart. What I found, it was interesting, you as you measured their degree of satisfaction with their work, they were relatively highly satisfied despite working against significant odds to keep these facilities open and functioning. What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. It's quite amazing in terms of the result that we had in terms of owner-operator satisfaction with, their career and their vocation, and that's a testament to the important role and the capability that these facilities deliver. And that's a really good headline. But of course, when we compare that to their attitudes about, how sustainable is their business, how secure do they feel, how happy are they with the level of funding they receive, it's a really interesting dichotomy. And you have highly motivated individuals that want to serve these diverse populations. And by the way, I have to note how diverse. We didn't actually capture, diversity information about owners and operators of these businesses, but this is an incredibly vibrant and diverse group of business owners that really encapsulate the American dream. We have people who've arrived from a variety of places around the world. We have people who've been longitudinally doing this in their families for multiple generations. It really is astounding and remarkable who serves, as owner and operators of these facilities. But at the same time, we have to concern ourselves with the fact that when we asked if people thought they were going to remain in this industry on a 5 or a 10-year timeline, that's a real challenge, for market users, who are looking forward to be able to make use of these facilities. And we have to do more to ensure that we're going to keep these very valuable resources in our community.
Yeah, we noted that, they were definitely, representing a diverse range of backgrounds, but that they were serving individuals from specific ethnic enclaves as well. And this is especially true, we noted, from the residential care facilities for the elderly, where they would provide services in secondary language or culturally specific foods and celebrations. So that was really a standout for us. And we think there's more of an opportunity there, not to just, label facilities that are going to serve one cultural or ethnic group, but to really, enhance what's already there.
You also mentioned, I can't remember if this was attached to a specific statistic or just one of your observations, that they do feel unseen and unheard in this, with respect to market users. Yeah. Were you able to measure that, or was that more anecdotal?
Look, that's largely an anecdotal finding. We heard it repetitively from owners and operators. We have just sort of general comments that we had as part of our data collection exercises, and frequently we said we need to be seen more. We need to be heard more. We need a voice in government. We need to be acknowledged for what we're doing. We need to be integrated into these systems and continuums of care. Although I can't recall a single operator who used the word continuum, but they definitely wanted to be involved in, these other systems that they believe, largely that they're already part of. And that's the tragedy.
You also mentioned in the report that there have been, we do want to give credit to LA County and even the state who is beginning to rise to the occasion to recognize that this is a crisis, a slow motion train wreck, as I like to describe it, but that some of the funding mechanisms or the grants that have been offered are really complicated and difficult to apply for. And if you're pretty much working 24/7 to run your ARF, trying to actually understand the sophisticated approach to applying for state or county money is very challenging. Do you have thoughts on that, Leila?
Absolutely. So last year, the state released the Community Care Expansion Program dollars, and that was open to both local jurisdictions, nonprofits, and for-profit businesses. So conceivably, any adult residential or residential care facility for the elderly that was going to serve individuals living with mental illness could apply, but the application having done one for a client, was so lofty. You need a project manager, you need a construction manager, you need to already have architectural renderings done, and we're talking 2-month timeline, maybe more if you were following the news early, but let's hope you got the information in time to act on it. Then, I think at least a 10-year, maybe 20-year pro forma, which is all the complex financials and what's a capitalized operating reserve. I mean, this is not something that's approachable or accessible, let alone putting the narrative together, having the planning meetings to figure out what's going to be in the proposal, right-sizing the opportunity. And then I want to say there's a long-term deed restriction. I'm not comfortable saying the number of years, but it was definitely beyond kind of what you can see ahead as a small business owner. Beyond 10 years, I want to say it was 20 or 30. Now it's happening. I know that there's going to be some funds available locally in LA County, and hopefully because the counties led that effort, it's going to be a more accessible process.
Now, just to be fair, just to come back to something you mentioned earlier, Carrie, the LA County Department of Health Services and the LA County Department of Mental Health, they both have enhanced rate programs that really are a lifeblood and a really good service. And I would feel remiss not to mention that they're at the county level doing a lot to ensure that owners and operators are sufficiently funded for serving, vulnerable populations. At the state level, I'm not really sure what the sort of visibility is in terms of, how that affects individual operators, but I don't really want, to make it seem like we're not acknowledging, the good work that's being done at some county agencies.
Yeah, and I missed talking about the assisted living waiver program, which is kind of a tiered payment system based on chronic health needs for dually eligible individuals who are part of the long-term care, they call them Medi-Medi, right? Mm-hmm. Qualify for Medi-Cal and Medicare. A lot of operators, when we called to say what we were doing and we'd like to talk to you for our research, they said, do you know how to get into the assisted living waiver program? I've been trying to work with somebody. I've paid a consultant. It's taking forever. And, there's an understanding that there's resources out there, but it's just getting through all of the red tape to access that. And then there's limited spots, right? There's only so many facilities that can be approved because there's only so many slots approved. And I think that's an example. Last time I checked, I think there were 8,000 spots in the assisted living waiver program, but how many Medi-Medi folks do we have in our state? How many would need the assisted living waiver if they had nowhere else to go?
Yeah, you point out in the study that you asked the question, what percentage of your residents are completely reliant upon public benefits to pay for their stay? And it was 95%. And there was a big dissatisfaction with just what we would call the basic Social Security rate, which is a dismal $40 a day. And I will refer listeners back to the first episode in this season 4 of the podcast where we talked with Rhoda and Gochin, who operate a 6-bed facility in the San Fernando Valley, and they just would not be able to take on more SSI only recipients. So this enhanced rate that you're talking about that the county provides, we really need to see it expanded to a broader universe of residents.
And that's the thing is, if the county had the funding, I'm sure they'd love to be able to, the stakeholders from Department of Health Services and Department of Mental Health, they'd love to be able to expand these programs. FSP, full service partnership. There are a lot of really important programs that they offer with enhanced and enriched rates. But again, you work with what you got, and that's largely a function of, funding allocation. Something I just wanted to point out is that 95% resident acceptance rate, that's specifically adult residential facilities, which draws me to another topic, which is about...
And did not include the RCFEs, is what you're saying.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
But in terms of adult residential facilities, we talk about facilities leaving the market all the time and how important this is, that we do more to stop people from leaving the market. But you need to look at this a different way, and that's that are there any rational incentives to have new ARFs created or to have new ARFs join the market? And as small business owners or as business owners, is there a case by government to encourage business owners to open new ARFs when they're not satisfied? The majority are not satisfied with the rate of SSI that they're receiving. It's not keeping up with CPI or inflation, and they don't really see that they're being acknowledged or that they're being integrated with these other, care situations and needs from across the community. So that's where I admit it was a slightly snarky comment, but we very seriously stated that ARFs are almost an endangered species because we're not doing enough to preserve the resource. And there's definitely a lot more the government could be doing to encourage the preservation of ARFs as well as support the preservation of ARFs and the important role they serve. Which
we will drill down more deeply in our second interview on this as we look at the recommendations. But I also thought it was interesting, and we won't elaborate now, but encourage listeners to read the report because you ask questions, if you had access to more funding to either provide physical improvements, their top choices are really about investing in just the quality and stability of the actual home or facility. And then you ask a good question about if you had more money to invest in resident services, what would you offer? And it correlates with the needs and desires of residents to be able to go places, to take an excursion somewhere, to have more activities, and that costs money.
Yeah, I mean, especially on the facility side, especially for these smaller facilities, they have a lot of deferred maintenance, and because of the relatively low level of recoupment that they receive from SSI and other things, a lot of these owner operators, especially the smaller ones, they can wind up with some really horrific backlogs of maintenance that can potentially shut them down. And, certainly with the experience of the pandemic, a lot of owners and operators face significant challenges in keeping their levels of services up with all of the restrictions and all of the things that they had to concern themselves with.
Did you want to say something, Leila?
Yeah. Just the counterpoint to the low SSI rates and how little that covers in, preserving an asset to run your business from, and then be able to invest in activities is on the resident side, they, after paying their, fee to reside in a licensed facility, are left with something like $100 a month. So that could be, just for your cell phone, or it could be for, the thing you want to eat or drink that's special, or your cigarettes or whatever it is. It's $100. Mm-hmm. So one thing, that doesn't enable a lot of autonomy, right? Even if an owner and operator facilitated going to the museum or something, it'd be nice and, really support freedom and self-autonomy, self-efficacy if individuals had some money to live with and be adults with. At whatever
and
level
also,
of
as I
competency
understand
they
it,
have.
under SSI rules, tell me if this is true. If you have more than $2,000 that you saved in your bank account, you actually could be penalized for saving money.
I'm not sure about that technical rule, but that sounds right to me.
In other words, it's we have. I think you used.
You can't collect assets.
In terms of public benefits, we certainly aren't as integrative in terms of enabling capability of individuals to make their way back from being dependent on them. Certainly, the reason why we asked the question to our 625 residents that we interviewed, would you be willing to take on work that was comfortable and commensurate with your skills and capabilities, but would not endanger your situation with public benefits? It was a surprisingly high proportion of individuals that were directly willing and able to do so. And anecdotally, we certainly heard from a lot of individuals that were not willing to go on the record, but willing to indicate that they had been undertaking some work.
What rings in my head is one of the interviews I had where one of the questions was, do you enjoy or appreciate your community? I don't remember the exact terminology, but they said, I don't go anywhere. And then on the CES provider side, they said when they're providing housing navigation services for individuals, there's still a fair amount of choice. Here's our housing plan. Here's what we're going to do to get you housed. So this individual was very knowledgeable of the licensed facility side of things. But they said, if you give somebody a choice between handing over the majority of their income to live in a licensed facility and have a roommate, right? You're sharing a room, or you can wait, pay, $200 a month, have a housing voucher, and move into PSH the choice is really clear.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a structural barrier too,
Yes.
is we're not making this an attractive offering for individuals who actually might need it.
Yes. Yeah. Try living on $100 a month for all of your ancillary needs. The fact that someone is providing 3 meals a day and doing your laundry is not that great of a trade-off when you think about what you're missing.
You need clothing, you need toiletries.
Bus passes. Maybe go to a movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good place to end this conversation. We just barely skimmed the surface. I guess I would just say, is there any other significant data point that we missed talking about today? We are going to come back a second time, and we're going to look at the relationship between our homelessness crisis and who's living in ARFs and RCFEs, and talk about your recommendations. But I want to give you the last word on anything salient we want to point out.
One thing that I would leave your listeners with about how the residents feel about their experiences, and again, this is so important because this is why we're supporting these facilities, is because they have clients, they have customers, they have residents. And we measured a battery of almost 12 different measures of client experience to really understand, and we asked them a series of 0 to 10 questions, 0 being you're completely dissatisfied, 10 being you're completely satisfied. Overall satisfaction, extremely high amongst ARF and RCFE residents, almost universally. Amongst different individuals or different residents with different vulnerabilities and different histories, we found a high level of consistency in terms of their overall satisfaction. Think about how many times, any of us encounter a situation where we hear that people are 8.8 out of 10, for a large population. That's the level of satisfaction that we heard from these residents.
It's a big number.
And that's probably the most important takeaway, is that if they weren't satisfied, and we were very careful to make sure that we had a very good selection of the residents that we interviewed. We didn't allow anyone to be proffered to us, and we weren't really biased in terms of who we selected. We were very diverse in our sampling. But to hear this population says that they are overwhelmingly satisfied with this, that shows how important, or it demonstrates how important this housing and health and care resource really is. Well,
and I applaud you for really taking the care to shine a spotlight on the human beings who are impacted by these policy choices that we are making or not making. Mm-hmm. So we will move on to our next conversation next time, and we'll talk about your recommendations and how we're going to use this data in order to try to address some of the very specific issues that you've raised so well in this report. So I thank both of you for being here today for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.
Hey, friends, thank you for listening. Next week in episode 5, we will return to finish this conversation and report on the link between the growing decline in licensed residential facilities and our crisis of homelessness. We will also distill down the 50-plus recommendations in their report to bring to the surface the top 10 for consideration. Please share this podcast link with your favorite elected official and download the report for greater insight. Thank you to Aaron Stern and the studio at Verdugo Sound for providing the technical support to produce this podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.